Welcome everyone. Thanks for being here for this very special occasion this afternoon. My name's Mark Byron and I work in the department, soon to be discipline of English at the University of Sydney. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Mariken Teeuwen from the Netherlands. I'll say a little bit more about Mariken and her work in a moment. But first things first, I'd like to make an acknowledgement of country. As most of us know, here we are on Gadi land, the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nations, and I'd like to extend my respects to elders, past, present and emerging. And as we went through in our little huddle on Monday, I explained the processes and kind of protocols of acknowledgement of country that have tended to coalesce over the last few years, and how there are protocols, formal or informal, but there are opportunities to learn as well. And one moment might present itself here for those who may not be as familiar with the traditional significance of this particular part of Gadigal country, the Camperdown campus of the University of Sydney. I won't dwell on this for too long, but the main quadrangle, of course, is the dominant building iconographically on the campus, and it's set, as you would expect, up on a rise. And if you look at some of the oldest photographs of the university from the 1850s and onwards, the main quadrangle sits in great Gothic isolation, usually with a bunch of cows and sheep and so forth milling around, maybe before the students got there. So it was set on farmland as it was out of the colonial kind of context. But of course, this part of Sydney's been a location and a conduit of knowledge and learning for tens of thousands of years. And whilst I'm no expert on this, I did learn that this hill on which the main quad is set is actually quite significant in terms of Gadigal country. So it's one of 7 or 8 in this area. So we have Chippendale down at Petersham and various other spots in the area, and these high points were meeting places for the communication and transmission of knowledge and learning, but also as a point of communication between different groups in this area. So it really has been a place of learning for longer than any of us can really get our heads around. So that's kind of my little extra bit to the acknowledgement of country. Thank you all for being here today. I'm sorry to drag you out of the beautiful sunshine, but it's great to be here to learn some more things, some new things about medieval manuscripts and annotation and so forth. But before we do that, firstly, I'd like to thank Mariken for making the journey from the Netherlands to Australia, and to Professor Ab de Jong as well from the University of Leiden. I also would like to thank the Chau Chak Wing Museum for giving us this space tonight. It's a beautiful auditorium and it's a little exhibition down the end if you want to have a look after the event tonight. And Felicity Nibbs and Craig Barker in particular have been fabulous in giving us this space and sort of tutoring us through the technology and the rest. I also obviously have a great debt to make to SSHARC, Sydney Social Sciences and Humanities Advanced Research Centre at the University of Sydney, the director we have here with us, Lee Wallace. And also I'd like to thank Nanda Yarosh and David Aviles Espinoza, who were fabulous in helping arrange the events of Mariken's Gilbert Fellowship, the 2 weeks that she's spending with us in SSHARC. So that's all been fantastic. Also, of course, I thank the audience members and those of you who were there at the huddle on Monday for producing such a wonderful event, actually. It was more than I could have expected. So I'll just pass over quickly to Lee, who'll say a couple of words. Thank you.
Okay, so my name's Lee Wallace and I'm the director of the Sydney Social Sciences and Humanities Advanced Research Centre, which is SSHARC, and it's my role to put SSHARC on an international map. So that's one of the things I have to do this year. And so I approached my friend Mark Byron to say, look, you know, we've got all these people working on textual scholarship, but we need something big to happen in that area. What do you think we can do? And Mark said to me, well, it just so happens, you know, I was going to do this thing and then COVID came along, but maybe I could reach out and bring this person across to Sydney. this person, of course, turns out to be Mariken Teeuwen, and I think I'm going to be grateful to Mark for a very long time, because I think already Mariken has set a new standard for what SSHARC can expect of its visiting fellows in 2-week periods. She has an extraordinary itinerary, both this week and next, bringing together all sorts of researchers from Sydney, but also librarians and other curators from across the university together to talk about marginalia. I look back at my undergraduate books and I see I was a notorious scribbler in margins. I cannot interpret any of the things I've written. My girlfriend, we lived separately for a long time. She inherited some of my books. She would spend hours crying over marginalia. She could not decipher, thinking it would somehow reconnect her to me. So I'm very excited to hear this lecture tonight. I'm very pleased to see that Mariken is here, that Ab has come with her, that he's agreed to this outrageous schedule, and that nonetheless you're also finding time to build in a road trip to your visit to Australia. So I think this bodes well. I hope this is the first of the first step in an ongoing collaboration between you and SSHARC and Mark and many other people who I've known by name for a long time but have never seen in the one room before. So it's very exciting to see that. Thank you.
Mariken, I'll try not to embarrass you too much, but I do want to give you a proper introduction. But just speaking about setting sort of land speed records with our schedule, we've just come from the Rare Books and Manuscripts collection in Fisher Library, where Julie Sommerfeld gave us a tour. Some really amazing, really quite varied collection of manuscripts and early printed books. So that's yet another thing we have to thank you for. You were the catalyst for that wonderful tour that we just had. So, without further ado, Professor Mariken Teeuwen is an intellectual historian of the early Middle Ages who combines knowledge of the practice of medieval learning with the development and design of digital tools. Another reason why this visit is very significant for us. So she manages the divide between some of the traditional disciplines of medieval Latin philology and opportunities afforded by developments in digital humanities, which is of interest to many people in this room. She is professor by special appointment at the Institute of History at Leiden University and senior researcher at, if I get my pronunciations correct, the Huygens Institute for Dutch History, is how I'm going to translate the Dutch that I have in front of me, in the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences. And she's a member of the International Committee of Medieval Latin. Professor Teeuwen heads the research group Innovating Digital Editions and leads the project eCodices NL, which I strenuously encourage people to go and look at if you haven't already. There's the URL is in some of the advertising, but you can ask me afterwards perhaps. Some of her major publications include what I consider to be the magisterial monograph Harmony and the Music of the Spheres, the Ars Musica in 9th century commentaries on Martianus Capella, which came out with Brill in 2002, as well as some really key articles and essays in the field. I've just picked out a couple of things today. The 2018 essay Practices of Appropriation, Writing in the Margin, which appeared in the Cambridge collection of essays, The European Book in the 12th Century, as well as a co-edited book with Irene van Renswood, the annotated book in the early Middle Ages, Practices of Reading and Writing, and that came out with Brepols in 2017. Another one of the books that I own is the edited collection with Sinead O'Sullivan, Carolingian Scholarship and Martianus Capella, 9th century commentary traditions on De Nuptiis in Context, and that was Brepols in 2011. So, as I alluded to just a minute ago, Professor Teeuwen is the recipient of a Gilbert Fellowship at SSHARC, and we're extremely lucky to have her visit the University of Sydney. I'm particularly grateful to her for making this trip in such precarious times, given that this fulfills a long-standing aspiration to collaborate, but we, of course, had to put that on hold for a couple of years. So we held a SSHARC research huddle on Monday on the topic of reception, the outstanding success of which stemmed from Mariken's brilliant opening talk on the glosses and autograph of the 9th century Carolingian scholar John Scotus Erugena, who's very close to my heart. Without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Teeuwen, who will speak today on the subject, Finding the Reader in Medieval Manuscript Margins. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. And of course, you embarrassed me hugely with this, but I'll take it in a stride. Yeah, I'm very grateful to SSHARC and to Mark that I've been invited to speak here and that I got the opportunity to visit this part of the world, which I would have never done if it was not for this invitation. So thank you for that. And I also thank you for actually opening my eyes to, by this practice of acknowledgement, you opened my eyes to the easy attitude with which I take my own intellectual context, where I'm coming from and how it works and why it is as it is. So yeah, I think it's really useful to be awakened to that. Thank you. Turning to the subject of today, finding the reader in medieval manuscript margins, I have a passion for marked books. And this photo was taken in Cambridge University Library just a couple of years ago, and it represents, I think, our current stand on writing in printed books. As long as they are not owned by yourself, you're not allowed to write in them. It's not something that we are encouraged to do. And if you find it, it's a curious example of someone's thoughts when reading the book or processing the book to prepare for an exam, for example. But in the world of the handwritten book, almost all books are marked. When a scribe finishes the copying of a text, and sometimes he accompanies it with a sigh, explicit feliciter, thank God it ends here, I'm done for the day. The work on a book had not finished. The text still had to be structured, checked, corrected, omissions were to be filled in, and in many cases glosses or annotations were added to the text to provide commentary, explanations, summaries, a list of subjects or some other kind of guidance for the reader concerning the content of the text, to point out its usefulness and maybe reliability or irreliability. And this whole process, obviously, if we look at our medieval manuscripts that survive, are part of the making of the book. As a result, we have very few books that do not have annotations. The reader, I would argue, does not sit at the other end of this process of making a book. He or she is part of the production of the book from the very start. It is with the reader in mind, or in some cases even by the reader themselves, that a book is produced. It is laid out the way it is because the reader likes, wants, or expects it that way. It has the extra elements that the reader requires, be it structuring devices, such as marginal keywords, or rubricated titles, or elaborate illumination. And this goes both for an individual reader, ordering a book for his own use, from a professional scribe, and also for a community of book producers or book users that create books for their library. or church or school or archive. The readers decide whether a book ought to be copied in formal or cursive style, whether it is to be copied on high or low quality parchment, with a spacious or a cramped arrangement on the page, and with elements that go beyond the main text or not. The reader is thus, in every step of the process, part of the making of the book, just because the makers of books are obviously also part of the community of people that use these objects. So, if I would take my own title in a broad sense, I could in fact now give a talk about any or every aspect of the handwritten book. But I'm not going to do that. I will instead focus on a trait of the handwritten book that, to my mind, brings us closest to the reader, and that is the annotations added by copyists and readers in the margins and interlinear spaces or flyleaves or inserted leaves in their books. These annotations allow us, in a sense, to see the book through their eyes, through the eyes of the reader. We see how a reader was interested in certain things and highlighted those in the text, how he or she tried to make sense of the text and add explanations, translations, summaries, schemes, how they were criticizing the text also by pointing out what other books or texts had to say about the same subject, or marking it up with signs especially used for textual criticism and content criticism. They also show us sometimes the world of the reader in an unintended way, for example, by adding doodles or pen trials that tell us something about their world, a sword fight, or a little bit of musical notation, or a prayer, or names, etc. These annotations especially present us the reader on a plate, give us the opportunity to cast a glance into their mind and see what they were thinking when reading, using, consulting, or simply handling the book. Over the past 15 years or so, I ran projects that focus on this other half of the book, the margins or the white areas in between the lines of text, flyleaves, or inserted strips of parchment. Yet it only recently started to attract the attention of modern scholarship. These parts of the book generally occupy as much as half of the actual space of the book, or more. Still, they have, generally speaking, not been included in our traditional text critical editions. Before the field of new philology shook up the old scholarly traditions of editing, editions were often explicitly aimed at deleting the marginal stuff around it, at cleaning the text from these later traces of use and restoring it to its original state, like a restorer would remove a yellowed layer of old varnish to bring out the original colors of a painting. But this changed, I think, from the year 2000 on, with the fast-growing number of digitized manuscript collections, which awakened a deeper awareness of the wide gap between printed editions and the actual medieval objects that contain versions of the edited texts. We came to realize on an unprecedented scale that manuscripts are wonderful objects. They are like Hermione's handbag in the Harry Potter novels. They may look unimpressive, an ugly duckling, but when opened, they reveal surprisingly many and big things. They have loads to tell about the times in which they were made and used, from its choice of parchment to the traces of its owners, commentators, and readers that became part of the book. The voices of the book, these books, the stories they tell with their content and traces of use have now become a popular theme. The visual presence of medieval books online has thus opened our eyes to the potential of their material phase as a source for all kinds of new research questions. It has propelled the book in the center of attention of a much wider audience. It has resulted in proper fan sites, blogs, Twitter feeds, online educational programs in paleography or chronicology, streams of photos on Pinterest, Flickr, and Tumblr, but also in previously unimagined research. It is in this new field of research that I too began my research into practices of annotating in the books of the early Middle Ages, inspired by the densely annotated manuscripts of Martianus Capella, as Mark Byron already mentioned. And then I began to explore the potential of annotations as sources for understanding early medieval intellectual life. But as one would expect when exploring uncharted territory, it turned out to be full of complications. Margins are dangerous territory. Paul Dutton once described them as the choppy seas that surround medieval texts. Let me explain. This image, I think, says it all, actually. But in almost every sense, marginal text defies the rules of regular text. It is written in a script that is often tiny at the edges of the page, which are the most vulnerable part of the book. It's not for nothing that they are kept clear in an ideal layout. The script is often less formal than that of the main text, which also means that it is less easy to analyze it in terms of date and location. We are not trained in the analysis of marginal script. Erik Kwakkel, famous paleographer now at Victoria, he once described paleography as having a zap moment. You see a script and then immediately things click in your brain and you know, oh, this is 12th century. This is 13th century. But with marginal script, we don't have the reference system that makes these things click in our brain because we are not trained on it. Often also the script is more informal, more personal, or just different because it's cramped in such a limited space. And not only in terms of paleography, but also in terms of language, marginal text is different from ordinary text. Grammar and style may be sacrificed. Not only abbreviations are more frequent, and here on this slide you see a very special kind of abbreviations. I don't know if you can see it, but here ways of writing that's not in a regular alphabet, but actually in Tyronian notes, a kind of latent Steno or ancient Steno script that was kept alive in the Middle Ages and still used and appropriated. The style itself can also be a kind of minimalistic staccato style, only understandable for the insider or the community of insiders. And since we are separated from author and insider by a gap of hundreds of years, we are at a great disadvantage when we try to understand what's going on. And just as the language, so the text itself also adheres to different rules than those we are used to. Marginal text does not fit the model of an original that is transmitted and as part of its transmission undergoes subtle changes, which can then be interpreted as corruptions. In the case of marginal text, there's much more freedom for the copyist, who can pick and choose what to keep, what to leave out, what to change. So the contours of marginal texts are really fluid, much more so than that of ordinary text. Also, a process of layering or accretion is prone to take place. So the presence of annotations in a manuscript seem to have a kind of magnetic force and attracts new, different layers of annotations, sometimes slightly later and sometimes much later. But these layers then also get copied elsewhere as a new entity, and they become an inextricable knot formed together. Or annotations that were once in the margin or in interlinear space may end up being part of the main text. It drives the traditional philologist mad, since each and every annotation in a commentary needs to be examined, to be unpacked, it needs to be examined on its own as well as part of the tradition that settled around a particular text. To read it, its clues is often a tour de force for the scholar who undertakes the tasks. I could continue talking about glosses and annotations in general for much longer, but I'd rather show you some examples. How can we find the reader in the margins of these medieval manuscripts, and what does their presence tell us? So I'll show you a few examples going through different ages of the Middle Ages that show us a portrait of the annotators and readers that were at work. The first manuscript I already showed on Monday. It's the magnificent manuscript with a great personality, Leiden University Library, BPL 67. This manuscript was produced on the continent in an Irish center. So Irish monks came to the continent and settled there in different monasteries and continued producing manuscripts according to their own custom and in their own style of writing. This manuscript has a date because a colophon was added to it, mentioning the date 838, and the name Duptach. You can see it there, Duptach hos versus transcriptit. And then there follows a riddle pointing out the specific moment in time when that was done. The manuscript contains Priscian's Periegesis, which is a poem about geography, and his famous Institutiones Grammaticae, so the fundamentals of grammar. This is a complicated, deep-digging book about Latin language and grammar, using Greek, a Greek-inspired philosophical approach. Most copies of Priscian, who flourished around the year 500, are annotated. Several gloss traditions have been recognized, and some go back right up to Priscian's own time. Looking at how this book was annotated, several observations can be made. First of all, compared to other copies of Priscian, I just randomly picked one from the Paris collection. This book, the Leiden book, was not so heavily glossed. It has a few longer glosses at the beginning of the treatise, but only a few of the glosses that were part of the set are found in the Leiden copy. We often find that glosses are copied at the beginning, but then dwindle out, like the copyists grow tired of copying all these tiny notes and they just forget about it. Second, we can also see that several hands worked on the glossing of the book in BPL 67. A contemporary with the manuscripts making an Irish hand-copied glosses, but also a Frankish hand. So you see the different script types in the glosses added to the text. Blank spaces are used to add extra material. At the end of the periegesis and before the preface of the Institutiones, a continental hand added a Greek glossary to the book. The most spectacular hand found in this manuscript belongs to the famous scholar John Scotus Eriugena, who lived from about 810 or 815 to 877. His handwriting has been studied by many, among others Bernard Bischoff and Edouard Journeau and Paul Dutton, and the identification is quite certain. We don't know when or where, but we do know that John the Scot definitely worked on this manuscript. And he was picking up mostly on the many Greek words included in Priscian's treatise. So we can see him providing short translations, extending quotes from the Greek. So if there's just a little phrase of Greek in Priscian, he extends that phrase to a somewhat larger unit. So he must have found it somewhere. And here we see on the bottom of the page a quote from Homerus in Odysseus, with an interlinear translation into Latin. So here we see how annotators worked ad hoc. We see them not copying a settled commentary tradition into their copy of Priscian, although they might have on occasion copied such existing glosses too. They also did not, in this case, prepare the page for receiving annotations. So there's no extra lines or no extra space around the text kept free for copying the glosses. Rather, in this case, Priscian's manual was used as a stepping stone to add material from John Scotus' own knowledge, finding a place in the margin to write down his rare Greek learning. What he intended to do with it is not clear. Maybe it was intended to be read and passed on. He may have written it down simply because he felt prompted by Priscian's text. He may also have wanted to make the copy of the text he was working on better to improve it. Thus, this manuscript then shows us the mind of a scholar, his interests and his methods. In this case, we even know who this scholar is and recognize his hand and intellectual profile in other manuscripts as well. In my second example, this is not the case. So here we have Paris, Bibliothèque Nationale de France, Latin 12949. This is a manuscript produced, end of the 9th century, beginning of the 10th century, in northern France. It's loosely tied to the circle of pupils around John Scotus Eriugena, but also other names appear in it. Here, for example, on the very top of the page, we have Haericus Magister Remigii. So this is Heirik of Auxerre, the master of Remigius of Auxerre. Both produced other texts as well, so we know them as authors. And then it says fecit has glossas, so he made these glosses. We have also the name of Israel Scotus and Israel the grammarian in this book. The book contains a collection of texts that centers around the discipline of logic. We have Aristotle, we have Augustine's Dialectica, Alcuin's dialectical works, the categories, Porphyry, Apuleius, Boethius, logical treatises, the whole lot. So if you thought that Aristotle only came into Europe in the Latin tradition in the 12th century, here is proof that that's not true. The book is densely annotated at certain texts. For example, here we have the opening page of the categories. But it also shows a different style of engagement with text, for example, in the form of inserted leaves, slips, on which notes are made. These are often little collections of extra material that was added, sometimes to support the points that were made in the main text, but also sometimes to contrast them or even contradict them. There is a dialectical engagement with the topics in the text that forms the basis of the dialectical method we find later fully fleshed out in the context of the medieval university. Yet, here we can see that in fact the method of scholasticism was not new. It was anchored in the older tradition of working with text, of correcting it and checking it and comparing it and bringing it into perspective by referring to other texts. The notes and added slips of paper, of parchment, give us a tantalizing glimpse into how this process worked in this particular manuscript. In the margins, we also find a number of diagrams summarizing and visualizing the context of the text in an abstract figure. And these diagrams bring us to our next example, which is a manuscript from Munich, Bayerische Staatsbibliothek 14272. This manuscript has a clear date and place, even a clear name attached to it. It was written in Chartres or Regensburg after the year 1006 and before the year 1028 or 29. It opens with a full-page picture of Hartwig of St. Emmeram, dedicating the book to the saint. Hartwig studied with Gilbert of Chartres for some time, and this book shows that aspect of him. The book is a curious mix of texts about music. We have Boethius' Fundamentals of Music, and also the Musica and Scodica and Kyriades, and texts about logic, mainly Boethius and Cicero's Topica. And in addition to the marginal annotations in the spaces between the text, we can see how Hartwig himself filled the blank pages with diagrams and figures. And on these pages, we can see how he works to process the texts he studied, how he broke it down into chunks that he then gave a place in his own mind map, maybe we could call it, to process it in his brain, summarize it and systematize it. My last example is from the third quarter of the 13th century. This is Paris, Bibliothèque Nationale de France, Latin 17806. It's a university textbook with texts from the Logica Vetus and the Logica Nova. So here we have the new logic coming from the new strand of logical texts via the Arabic into the Latin world. We have Aristotle's Predicamenta, Peri Herminias, Liber Sex Principium, Boethius De Divisione, Topica, Aristotle's Sophisticis Elenchis, etc. It's a whole compendium made for the Faculty of Arts of Paris, obviously for the purpose of studying the arts there. The book was probably made in England. We know that from the illustration style that was used mostly, but it was made for an English student studying in Paris. It was part of the collection of the Church of Notre Dame in Paris, at least from the 17th century on, but I guess it was already there in the 13th. The content of the book, but also the layout, are characteristic of a university book. On the left, you can see how the page was divided into a grid. The yellow lines are mine, of course. And each section could house commentary. And this way, the page could contain lots of commentary without making the reader lose his way. It would still line up roughly to the lines in question in the middle of the page. Secondly, small but detailed illustrations are found in this beautifully executed book that reveal its function. We have a master teaching a student and two students engaging in a dispute, which was the key logical exercise and also examination form at the arts faculty. I think it's time to come to a conclusion. Today, I showed you a set of examples of readers annotating their books, one from the 9th, one from the 10th, one from the 11th century, and my last example was from the 13th century. We saw examples of commentary, which was both transmitted as a text from manuscript to manuscript and open to a certain kind of layering, addition, and transformation. Commentary texts are almost always the result of a dynamic process, and their shape and content are only rarely fixed. The nature of many commentary texts strongly suggests a context of education. The margins and interlinear spaces are full of annotations that focus on a correct text, grammar, syntax, poetic techniques, rhetorical figures, and vocabulary. A second important goal of the marginal annotations seems to have been to organize and summarize text. Definitions are repeated in the margin, keywords are added to make it easier to find one's way, and concise tables are shaped to make pieces of learning more memorable. Thirdly, it is very obvious that the learning of one text was usually connected to the learning of others. Authorities on certain subjects are collected in the margins and compared to each other. This last characteristic of commentary enriches the setting of the study of these texts. Traditionally, books with annotations or commentaries are seen as school books, but they should also be seen as books of scholarship, scholarly discussions, and dossiers for scholarly disputes. Precisely these annotations are intriguing sources to study the intellectual history of the time. They bring us as close as possible to the monk or scholar who wrote them with his quill. Some hands in scholars have been identified, such as the hand of John Scotus Eriugena or Hartwig of St. Emmeram. But some scholars or scholarly circles have such a specific fingerprint or profile for their annotations that we may even use these to identify their books and study their contacts, their networks, or travels. The anonymity of the glosses should not hold us back in our exploration. The techniques of annotating themselves, rather than their identification or even their content, are in themselves useful tools to gain a better understanding of early medieval intellectual life. A lot of exploring still remains to be done. The focus on the center of the page has been so strong in modern scholarship for so long that the treasure trove of undiscovered and unstudied material in the margin is still very large indeed. Last but not least, the voices in the margin show us playfulness and humor, most of all humanity, I would say. They show us the people behind the book. They reveal how medieval readers and writers worked with their texts, how excited they were about them, and how bored they were with them. The looking glass of the margin, we managed to make the gap between their distant time and ours considerably smaller. Thank you. There's time for questions.
We have plenty of time for questions, actually. I bring a little bit of bad news. Maybe in the upstairs in the photos we decided that afterwards. So that does actually give us more time for questions. Not on that subject, on another subject. So please, if, we have a roving mic, so if people have questions they'd like to ask or comments they'd like to make, please.
Thank you so much. Extremely interesting. My question, do we have any information, instructional information, as to how one annotates? Or is it entirely haphazard and purely personal predilection? Part two to my question is there a subgroup that you're aware of where we can see a hierarchy as to do with, well, interlinear will deal with this sort of topic. And if you have an ample margin, even though you might prefer to put it in the margin, by dint of what you're dealing with, it should be interlinear. Are there any such sort of rules of the game that you're aware of, particularly with, say, a subset of manuscripts? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. I've been trying to figure out the systems and trying to find the texts that talk about practice, but they are very, so the last category is very, very few. We have some instructional texts telling us how to deal with signs in the margin, such as the critical signs that were inherited again from late antiquity. So they were used according to certain systems, and these systems are described. We also have examples, regional or even personal examples of teachers who did things a certain way and taught their students to do that too. So we have, for example, in Lyon, Flores of Lyon, a deacon who was master of the scriptorium and wanted things to be done in his scriptorium in a very specific way for a very specific purpose. So he taught his students how to do that. And he also corrected them if they did it wrong. But otherwise, there are no texts saying how you should copy manuscripts in general. So there's also no instructional guides how to copy marginal texts. And if we look at the books themselves, then it's very clear that well, some general rules apply. So longer text goes into the margin and shorter vocabulary things go interlinear. And it's also clear that they copy, so yeah, there's a distinction between settled commentary tradition that were copied along with a main text and ad hoc annotations that accumulated in the margin because the texts were used over a longer period in a certain center. If you look at the settled commentary traditions, then you can see that it's very clear that in some cases, that it's very clear that the main text was copied and the commentary text was copied, and that they used the layout of the exemplar to do it. So I didn't show it here in this presentation, but sometimes signs were used to bring together the marginal note with the place in the main text where it belongs to. I think I have one example here. So you can see here, this is a peculiar manuscript from Cambridge University Library, and it has a fish in the margin and a fish there in the main text that marks the place where this marginal note belongs. And so that's a one-off. I've never seen anywhere else animals used for this. It's our note number, right? But you can see that from copy to copy, sometimes these signs are actually copied along. So then you keep the main text, but you also see it on the page. So sometimes that's the case, but in other cases it's something like that. They copy the main text, they get commentary from different books and copy it also in the margin. So it's very difficult to pin down a system. It's my short answer to your complicated question. And I think, yeah, so, maybe if I spend 15 more years on it, then I'll be able to say something more substantial to your question. But now I always think, oh, I found a system, I found a ground, and it's broken. The university manuscripts, like the 13th century Aristotle manuscript that I showed, this is very typical. And I think that here, first commentary by the first master going there, and then we go in the upper and the lower mark. There are different factors. I don't know exactly how it works for the Aristotle manuscript, but that has been described. So this is a more systematic approach to especially then, let me see, well, this. Or one of the first examples, this. There's not even the word page in this. Yeah, you can see here the signs that I used to connect to the main text, the place to the main text. How much was that actually? Oh, it's quite a large book, A4, about A4, but it's tiny, tiny writing. Yeah. And also, this makes me think, how were they using this? How were they reading this? Must have been very slow kind of reading. When you say, well, this is a teacher's book, and the teacher used this in class. I wouldn't be able to use such a thing in class. Who could help it? You have to be very slow and very studious to make your way through all these layers of text that are brought together on one page. I can imagine that as a copyist, you keep this up for a couple of pages and then think, my head hurts.
you said about, I should be okay. You can all hear me? No. Given what you've said about, well, what we all know about the orality of medieval culture and the fact that all of these manuscripts would have been read out loud, how does the marginalia fit into that oral culture? Do they also, are they not oral? Are they silent? Are they, how does that sort of connect? Or does it even connect at all?
Elements that can't be oral, like the Teeuwen or the diagrams and figures. They can't be oral. They can be used by a teacher to explain something, but they can't be read out. So when these elements are in there, I think that leads us away from the general notion that things were oral up to the 11th century and then became silent. I don't believe it. Silence can go on before that. And this is true.
Hi, thank you for this talk, and I really liked your conclusive remark about the marginal annotations being and offering us an insight into the humanity of medieval people. And about that, I was wondering if I was wondering about reactions to these marginal annotations. And in particular, if you find in documentation, in letters, in correspondence in general, or in any kind of written documentation, if you find comments about those marginal annotations, if there are any kind of written reaction to not only reading manuscripts, but having read the annotations and reacting to these to find them, I don't know, interesting, adding a perspective to the text, or being annoying because the annotator has, I don't know, misunderstood the text. So is there anything about that, whether it's actually coming from the Middle Ages or even later, if you get any interest in that?
Yeah, again, a really interesting question, to which I don't have a certain answer. So we do find corrections on marginal annotations. Some are scratched out, or some are refreshed also, or some are like, for example, you have a system of signs that is used for critical reading, but it changes over time. So where first an obolus is used, later on another sign is used to point out text that is fishy or somewhat not to be trusted. And then another sign is also appearing in the margin to make clear this is the old sign, but now we use this sign. So in that sense, we have a kind of response reinforcing or going against the note in the margin. I also think of a remark by, I can't remember from who it is from, but it's a late late medieval complaint from, I think, a teacher at the University of Paris who says that students maltreat their texts and they annotate books indifferently with snotty noses dripping on them and making them all dirty. And so in that sense, we have a complaint about students doing too many things to their texts. Do we also have reactions on glosses? Well, I don't know about any texts saying, describing this as annoying, that people are scribbling down or corrupting their texts with too many notes. But I haven't been looking for that, so yeah, would be interesting. Yeah, interesting question. Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. My question is, who was entitled to write marginalia, right? So the examples you gave were of elite scholars, teachers, elite students, or owners. Right?
Yeah.
Now, given how hierarchical society is and how
Yeah.
expensive manuscripts are,
Yeah.
I would have thought that a first-year novice would not be entitled to write in the monastery's copy of text X, right?
Yeah,
So
this
is that the case? I mean, you just mentioned students, right? Complaint. I would have thought that those students own those manuscripts. So you're not talking about a student writing, first-year student writing in the monastery's copy, right? Is that the case?
Yeah, so yeah, this is also a highly debated subject in manuscript studies. Who was allowed to write in a manuscript? And the general understanding is that in a scriptorium, the master of the scriptorium was the only one who was allowed to write material in a manuscript other than just the copying of the text, obviously. But I think that the manuscripts themselves rather contradict this notion because they are so full of notes and little additions everywhere in the margins and on the flyleaves of scribes just noting down things and adding things, and so there must have been more freedom than the general opinion in medieval scholarship states. The students, in the history of the university, the copying of the books that were used by teachers and students was severely regulated. So we have the university producing authorized copies of the textbooks that were used in class. And you were allowed to hire them for money to have them copied in order to make your own copy. You could do that yourself, or you could, if you were rich, then you could hire someone who earned his living with doing that. So it's very strict. You should use authorized copies in the class, but at the same time, you see all kinds of copies in the university scribal culture that have unauthorized versions of texts, that have combinations of texts, that have unknown commentaries on texts. Maybe they were written down when a teacher was actually teaching. So again, there you have the official standpoint, and that's what the manuscript evidence itself shows you. So I think in principle you're very right. It was a hierarchical society where things were organized in a certain way, and it was not vanzelfsprekend. It was not obvious that someone could write in a manuscript, but in practice you see a lot more freedom than the rules state. For example, if we go to, well, this here, very weird, right? This is in a copy of Prometheus Princess. This is a monastic text about logic, very dry material, logical statements work like this, and examples, and these categories of logical statements, and you must learn about all the definitions and how they actually work, and then this is with which that was illustrated. And in the same manuscript, there's a list of examples laid out in 3 columns, 4 columns, and then on the top of it, a large penis hovers. Or this illuminator was obviously somehow preoccupied with the and this is a 13th century manuscript with Prometheus, the Consolatione Philosophiae. So this is the section where the Wheel of Fortune is discussed. And then a 14th century comes in, writer comes in, commentator comes in, and illustrates it with his own Wheel of Fortune. I think this probably wasn't allowed, so it was done anyway.
I've got the microphone. Mariken, thank you so much for that. I have a question about language. My area is later centuries, and so I was very stimulated by what you said about the era of translation and the pre-existence of Aristotelian texts in on the continent in this era. And so, for the, let's say, 13th to 17th century, the story of marginalia is one about the Western European mastery of multiple languages, first classical Latin, and then Greek, and then, Syriac and Hebrew, and Arabic, and indigenous, and eventually Asian languages. So, but in the 500 years before then, we also see multiple languages in the margins, Greek. And so what's the story of sort of the use of the margins for languages other than the main script of the text in terms of the reception of, all the traditions that are coming out of antiquity and late antiquity? It's clearly not the same model as those later centuries. What is the story of, Greek and, do we see any Arabic or they're not really, people aren't dealing with, so what is the story that we can tell about other languages in the margins other than the main text? Main text language, I mean.
Yeah, that's a nice question, because glosses were originally studied because they they held the first evidence of several vernacular languages, of Old High German, Old Irish, Romance languages. So in the glosses, you find, mainly the interlinear glosses, you find translations from Latin terms into vernacular terms. And that was why they were studied originally in around 1900. So for a long time, for example, editions of glosses only contained the vernacular glosses added to Latin. So I didn't see manuscripts when I was studying. I only saw manuscripts when I was doing my graduate studies. And I thought that these manuscripts only had vernacular glosses, but actually they had loads of Latin glosses, Latin glosses, and then some vernacular glosses interspersed. So we have a lot of bilingual glossing going on in the manuscripts too. I'm not sure whether you want me to sketch general patterns of this or... yeah. Yeah. No, I haven't come across something that really shocked me. But you can see that in the 9th century, scholars were very interested in Greek, Hebrew, and that so the bilingual glossing, the Old High German and Old Irish, that's also really interesting in terms of grammatical teaching. So the grammarian handbooks, they have those bilingual glosses because clearly it's about language and vocabulary and translating and understanding the structure of a language. So there it is useful to bring in vernacular terms and examples. For the later periods, so Arabic, we only find it, well, I think from the 11th century on, combined with Latin. I don't really know a whole lot about it, but so we also have the genre of glossaries, of dictionaries, as you could call it, of different words in different languages translated with Latin words. And here, of course, there's a close connection to glosses that you also find in margins and interlinear spaces. One of the questions I struggled with was, were these glossaries used to annotate texts? How did they, goes back to the first question that was asked, how did they write these glosses? How did they compose these glosses? Did they use books from the library to add new stuff in a text? Or was it all from the mind, from the memory, and from copying? I don't know a certain answer to that, but I definitely think that there's an overlap, the same kind of background of what knowledge is, of what learning is, goes through both traditions, the glossaries and the glosses. So someone has to look into this and find out precisely how this works. I tried to get my PhD to do that, but she went off in another direction.
Thanks very much. That was a great last question. I was thinking that the whole way. You mentioned the Irish monks on the continent who were producing Latin manuscripts, but also using Old Irish in the marginalia, I believe, from what you just said. And you also the theory of silent reading at the period. I don't think it's true because the idea that all those manuscripts were read out loud. You said yes, there is silent reading going on, and we can see it here. And it made me think of the probably out-of-date books now, but was it Sanger and Parks and the theories about how silent reading evolved, and the theory was that it was the Irish monks whose relationship to Latin, they found Latin very difficult compared to the continental monks. So they started to put dots between the words, which was the sort of early punctuation, and then that evolved into the spaces, or little marks and all of the punctuation. But it did make me think that perhaps different groups who are producing these manuscripts may have different practices amongst themselves as groups, and perhaps their relationship to Latin as a foreign language is different from, there's no homogeneity in these groups of monks and these people who are producing the text themselves. And is there in your research any evidence or things that you've noticed about different, different relationships of foreignness and nativeness with respect to the production of this marginalia? And are they, is there any sense of a collective project in certain scriptorium, for instance, of certain monks thinking through their language as they're annotating or producing marginalia?
Well, not so much in terms of language, I would say, but in terms of level of education, yes. So there's very, you can really see, oh, this is meant for highly educated people, and it was also produced by highly educated people, monks, and this is for the lower classes, for the introductory levels. They use different practices of writing in the margin, and you find certain practices like the Tironian notes or the abstract visualizations. These are really aimed at a very high level of intellectual engagement with the text. And of course, the texts themselves also reveal a lot about which level of learning it is. But in terms of language, I think all over Europe, Latin was the language in which one thought, wrote, read all over Europe. And it was almost never the vernacular, especially in the early Middle Ages. So where you do find a large body of Old Irish glosses in the Prussian manuscripts, for example, I think that is something that's specific for the Irish, and also something that a practice that they devised themselves to train their Latin ability even more. But Latin was the main language of reading and writing. It was just, if you learned how to write, you learned Latin. Yeah. Does that answer your question? No, probably not.
We can talk about it more later.
Thank you so much. I found that so interesting, and I love the idea of the text as a living artifact. I think that's just fascinating. And it occurred to me in tracking your different, very human interactions with these texts that there are lots of different things going on. There are these kind of aids to understanding the text, and then there are these sort of displays of knowledge. So I'm kind of writing this marginalia, so you'll think how wonderful I am. One of the things that really fascinates me is engagement directly with the author, and I'm particularly interested in whether you can see in the marginalia whether there are kind of norms that get challenged. And so, for instance, some of the texts that I work on are very strongly, they're kind of panegyrical texts, and they'll say things like, you know, you won't believe it, but, you know, this person was this amazing, or they'll hold up particular figures as exemplary and praiseworthy. Do you get the marginalia being used to kind of challenge that, or challenge different norms of yeah?
Yeah.
Kind of general question.
Yeah, we have these practices too, in the margins. So actually my colleague Irene van Renswoude, she would be the better person to answer this question, because she's researching practices of censorship through the margin. And she found lots of examples of texts being added to, for example, church fathers, or church fathers who somehow in their life came on the list of forbidden church fathers, how they are marked up to warn the reader, like, this is fishy, this is not to be trusted. So they have special signs for that in the medieval system of writing. The obilus, meaning spare, indicated where a text was that should be scratched out, should be taken out of the collection, but they were in fact not taken out of the collections. They were copied with a warning, and sometimes even copied with a warning stating, this is a text that's forbidden, but we keep it here because from reading it you can learn what kind of knowledge is supposed to be forbidden, or what the wrong knowledge is, so that you can later on learn how to detect it yourself if it's not indicated. So there are again, there's a rule, you shouldn't be able to read these texts, and then there's the practice that goes against that, and that says, here's the text, you're not allowed to read it, but read it because you can learn from it. Yeah, are these texts, these copying practices are just fascinating, I think, and we should study them to learn more about it. Yeah. And you also, so you have, she has wonderful examples of texts that are scratched out, but then of course it's very difficult to date the scratching. When was this scratched out? But you also have marginal texts there that say, don't read this, or read this with caution, and then you can date those remarks. That's good. And you also have texts that praise the text. So they say, this is good, this is better, this is excellent. And you have the marginal annotations that say, hoi, male, pessimus. So then, you know, no, don't read that.
This is just a continuation of that, that theme of prohibition and censorship and that sort of thing. I'm wondering, just the example that comes to mind of the various prohibitions that happened at the University of Paris throughout the 13th century, including Aquinas at one point, or maybe 2 points. You know, for various reasons, you know, the Averroistic influence was seen as very, you know, to be forbidden and shut down and so forth. But I imagine there would be a fair bit of textual evidence around that kind of regulation of which texts were deemed to be, you know, safe and orthodox, and which were to be known about as dangerous instead. But I don't really know too much about.
Yeah, so I haven't studied that material, but I know there is a material in the statements of the university about these prohibitions against these texts. So yeah, that is known. But in the earlier Middle Ages, There was no institution like the university to forbid texts. The Pope was the ultimate authority to forbid texts. So then they came on a list and were forbidden. But it's very interesting to track the history of these texts through their copies, through their actual exemplars. For example, there was a large predestination debate in the 9th century around Gottschalk of Orbais, who held very contested views about predestination, double predestination. So God actually knew already in his mind whether you were going to heaven or hell. And nothing that you could do on earth would change that, because God already knew what you would do. So time is not. And then people came in against this and said, well, but what about free will? If everything is already settled, then free will it's also part of our Orthodox theology, but it doesn't have a place in this belief. So they debated in front of the king. Gottschalk lost, and he was excommunicated and silenced. He wasn't allowed to speak anymore. He was allowed to write, though, but not to speak. And if we look at copies of Gottschalk's treatises on predestination, you see that they still remain copied, and sometimes with very subtle changes, so that the sting is taken out of the text. Instead of double predestination, it is just predestination and no longer double. Or sometimes even just by reversing the sense of a sentence of Gottschalk, where he says, it is not the case, and then something follows, and then the copy says, it is the case that, and then the sentence follows. So, yeah, this has been studied by Warren Pesay, very in a lot of detail, and he pointed out that even when a text was so clearly banned by all the authorities, and it was still copied and subtly changed, and it still had a life.
Well, we might thank Mariken for her wonderful.
I thank you for your wonderful and challenging questions.
There's one more thing, though. In the spirit of collaboration between our institutions, a member of this institution informed me that they were not prepared to let you leave for home without them accompanying you. They want to be a mascot and an envoy. So you'll see what I mean in a moment. So will you take Sydney Bear with you?
Thank you
Excellent.
so much.
Hopefully easy to pack into your luggage, so or it's hand luggage indeed.
Yeah.
Thanks everybody for being here. It's been a fabulous event, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
The number of times you said fish.
Hello, hello, yes. Yes, yeah, it's a good idea. Yes. Yeah. 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 Ah, yes.